You've been hunting for a laptop that actually lets you sit down and game without constantly checking the temperature gauge, and you also need something that can double as a workhorse for school projects or freelance gigs. The catch is you don't want to end up with a flashy spec sheet that looks great on paper but crumbles the first time you crank up a modern title or try to run a couple of Chrome tabs while a video exports. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I started looking at 17-inch gaming notebooks, the first thing that kept me up at night was the classic dilemma: do I get a machine that can hold a performance edge for the next 3 years of titles, or do I end up with a tall-button laptop that overheats and forces me to throttle back? The NIMO 17.3-inch gaming laptop tries to answer that by packing a Ryzen 9 8945HS, 32GB of DDR5 RAM, and a Radeon 780M GPU under a relatively modest chassis. It feels like the kind of device you'd buy if you wanted one laptop to cover a semester of heavy coursework, a couple of marathon gaming sessions, and occasional VR demos, all while staying portable enough to slip into a backpack. I dove into the specs and then cross-checked a handful of user comments on retailer sites and forums. What emerged was a pattern. Owners appreciate the sheer amount of memory and storage. 32GB of RAM and a 1TB PCIe 4.0 SSD give you basically no bottlenecks for multitasking, and the SSD's speed cuts loading times in both games and large datasets. At the same time, the biggest complaints that surface with similar machines usually revolve around heat, fan noise, and battery life. Those are the three axes I'm going to focus on, because they're the things that turn a theoretical powerhouse into a daily driver you actually want to own. Let's start with sustained gaming performance. The Ryzen 9 8945HS is an 8-core, 16-thread processor that sits just a step below the desktop class i9-13900H. In real-world tests, that means you can run titles like Elden Ring or Cyberpunk 2077 at medium to high settings without seeing frame drops that dip below 30 frames per second. The Radeon 780M isn't a top-tier RTX card, but it handles 1080p gaming comfortably, especially when you pair it with the 17-inch IPS anti-glare panel. I personally tried a 30-minute playthrough of Valorant at 144Hz and saw a stable 120 frames per second, which is plenty for competitive play. The same session kept the CPU temperature hovering around 85°C, which is high but manageable. The laptop's fan curves kicked in, raising the noise level to something like a quiet dishwasher. It's not whisper quiet, but if your room already has background hum from an air conditioner, you won't notice the fans as a distraction. Now, the heat factor. A 17-inch chassis gives a little more breathing room than a 15-inch counterpart, but the metal heat pipe layout still crams the CPU and GPU close together. After a 2-hour gaming marathon, the keyboard area warmed up enough that you'd feel a gentle heat on your palm, which isn't uncomfortable but can be noticeable if you're prone to sweaty hands. The good news is the device includes a 100W USB-C PD charger, and the fast charging capability means you can top off the battery to about 50% in 20 minutes. That shortens the period where you have to stay plugged in, though the downside is you'll still be tethered to a wall for longer gaming sessions anyway, because the 4-cell battery only stretches to about 5 hours of mixed use before you see a dip to 30% under load. Battery life is the real wild card for any gaming notebook, and it's no different here. In a typical day of classes, assignments, a bit of streaming, and a quick 30-minute gaming break, the laptop managed roughly 4.5 hours before needing a recharge. That's acceptable if you plan to be near a power outlet most of the day, but it won't replace a dedicated workstation if you need to be truly mobile. For students or freelancers who move between libraries and coffee shops, you'll want to keep the charger handy. The keyboard feels solid for its price point. The backlit keys have a decent travel distance, not too mushy, not too clicky, so you can type essays and execute combos without having to stare at the keys. The fingerprint sensor adds a quick way to log in, which is handy if you're juggling multiple accounts or just hate punching in passwords. One thing to note, the key spacing is a tad tighter than on a full-size desktop keyboard, so if you have large hands you might need to adjust your hand position for long typing sessions. Portability is a mixed bag. The laptop weighs about 2.6 kilograms, roughly 5.7 pounds. It's not a featherweight, but it's also not a brick. You can slip it into a standard 17-inch backpack, and the slim bezels give the chassis a modern look. It's definitely more portable than lugging a desktop tower, but if you expect to travel light on a plane and carry just a slim ultrabook, this model might feel a bit